This is a tutorial all about counteroffers. There are 3 different counteroffers that we're going to take a look at, and I'm going to talk you through them so that if you follow the instructions, you'll be able to fill them out. So we're going to start with the seller counteroffer, and this is the most common. The reason is that a buyer will submit an offer, and then the seller will need to counter it. So the seller is going to use their own counteroffer, and the seller is going to put number 1. And that's important because if the countering escalates to where the buyer counters and the seller has to counter again, they're going to put a number 2 there. So since this is the first counter, presumably from the purchase agreement, we put a number 1 here. We write in the property address here. We check the box of the form that we're countering. In this case, we're countering a purchase agreement. So we check that box. If this was a buyer counter offer, like let's say the buyer countered the seller's counter, the buyer would check a box, or the seller would check a box here, write buyer counter offer number 1. Whatever is being countered is addressed here. And then it says date of form, and there's instructions, date the above checked form was prepared. The reason is that it's important we identify each form in a sequence of counters so that there's a continuity between the terms that are being negotiated. So without making this sound confusing, we're, in this case, seller counteroffer number 1 to a purchase agreement and the date of that purchase agreement. Sometimes people redraft purchase agreements and it makes a mess and there's different dates, but that's the date of the purchase agreement. Just like if you were countering a counteroffer, you'd put the date of that counteroffer there. Now here is where you're going to put the terms. And so you can just simply write in line items. I like to put numbers. So numerically, I'd put 1, and then I'd say something like sales price to be blank, and that's what I'd counter. 2, close of escrow to be 45 days after acceptance. You can also do A, B, and C. Some agents write lines as if they're just typing a paragraph. I think it's kind of hard to read for people, and I think that if you can just do bullet points, it's best, and there's plenty of space to write a ton of information. Now, this counteroffer does expire at 5 p.m. on the 3rd day from when this is signed and sent over to the other party. Or if you want to put pressure, if the seller says, look, I want the buyer to be able to respond, let's say within 24 hours, that can be written right here. And a time, or well, actually a date would be written right here. So if you're doing this on, let's say the 11th, then you can have it so that on the 12th at 5 p.m. this expires. You just write that there. And so if you left it alone, there's basically the 3rd day, 3 days before this expires, but you can shorten that time frame if you want to put pressure on the other party to make a decision. And then this is where the seller is going to print their name and sign. Now, if a buyer is countering, a buyer needs to sign the offer and the counteroffer. Every preceding document when it comes to a purchase contract and offers needs to be signed by both parties. But there should always be a box checked. So let's say you're a buyer and you receive this counter from the seller, and you're going to counter one term. There's one more thing, and so you're going to send a buyer counteroffer. Well, you still need to sign this form. The difference is that you check this box because it's saying, yes, I accept the terms on here subject to the following modifications in the buyer counteroffer 1 that I'm going to prepare. That's what you'd put here. Sometimes people are afraid to sign preceding counteroffers, but keep in mind that even when an offer is drafted, the seller should be signing an offer and checking the box that they're signing the offer subject to this counter, and then this is the counter they would include. And it doesn't matter if you have 10 counteroffers go back and forth. All those preceding counteroffers need to be signed. You just need to make sure that you're checking boxes each time, so that each counter is subject to the terms of the next counter. And this is where the buyer would sign if they're countering. Now, if the buyer's just agreeing to it and not countering, then there's no need to check the box. The buyer's just executing this. And if the seller already signed the offer and the buyer's signing here, then you have a fully executed contract. Now, if the buyer is going to counter, the buyer can come over here onto this form 103. They can put their buyer counteroffer 1, property address. It's very likely they're countering the seller counteroffer number 1, so we'd put that in there. Of course, if this keeps going and the seller counters again, that'll be the seller's counteroffer number 2, and it can just keep going. So that's why you're identifying these documents with which number counter and the date that that form was prepared. So you'd say the seller counteroffer number 1, you put the date of the form, and then you put whatever you want to modify. Now remember, a counteroffer. So people often, I'll see this is a common mistake. Let's say the buyer is countering the seller's counter, and they like 2 of the terms, but not the other terms. Well, I commonly see mistakes made where the buyer's agent will write the terms that the buyer agrees with from the seller counteroffer. You don't need to do that. That's redundant. Those terms already continue on. They convey. The only thing you're doing is amending the seller's counteroffer. You are just simply changing whatever you don't like on it. So if 9 out of 10 terms on a seller counteroffer are acceptable, but there's one that isn't, you're only putting that one term in here. That's the only thing you put. It's implied that it's not even implied. It's explicitly written that basically everything in preceding forms carries over and is agreed upon with the exception of whatever's put here. So that's why you don't put what you agree with. That's already agreed. You just put what you want to change. That's why if you start with a bunch of terms on a counteroffer number 1 and there's a bunch of counters going back and forth, then the amount of terms being negotiated should shrink every time because they're no longer countering what they agree with. They're only countering what they disagree with. And that number is going to get smaller and smaller and smaller as both parties finally carve it down to an agreeable document. And then you're going to have the same third day for expiration by default, or you can put a date and a time that will add pressure. Now, if the seller wants to agree, they sign here. If they want to counter and do a seller counteroffer number 2, then they'll go right here, check this box, and write they accept subject to the counteroffer number 2. What happens if they sign here, they check this box, and they send a seller counteroffer number 2, and the buyer says, I don't agree, I'm walking away, and they walk away? Does that mean that because they signed this, the seller's stuck? No. It means the deal never was consummated. It never came into existence. It never came to be. So every good measure, proper form is all these documents are signed and the box is checked if you continue to counter. Now we're going to jump over to the third one. This is the seller multiple counteroffer. Very similar to the seller counteroffer that we've gone through. Same idea up here in the beginning. Less space for the terms to be negotiated. However, if you want to add more space, just add an addendum on. Not a big deal. And that just use an addendum for additional provisions. I mean, you can even create a Word document and just call it Exhibit A if you wanted to, and then write in Exhibit A to be incorporated. But the point is, very easy to add on more text. Here's the difference though. So same expiration. The difference is this. The seller signs, the buyer signs and returns it. Seller acceptance, this is the difference right here. This box is what makes this different than the seller counteroffer. Required to make this document binding. If the buyer signs it and returns, this is not an executed document. It requires a second and third signature. A second signature by the seller, totaling 3 signatures. Seller signs once, buyer signs once, seller has to sign again. The reason is that in a multiple counter scenario, it's assumed that the buyer, that there may be multiple buyers that sign an agreement and send it back to the seller. Well, a seller can't sign and execute multiple agreements because they can only be contractually obligated to sell their home to one party, one home to sell, one contract, one party. That's it. So if the seller gets a bunch of these counteroffers back, signed by buyers, then the seller needs to then choose which counteroffer to sign. Because and that's how a seller avoids getting multiple counters signed by multiple parties at once, creating a huge conflict. Instead, buyers can sign the form, they'll send it back to the seller, and then the seller chooses which of those multiple counters to sign. And at that point, upon this seller's signature in this box in section 5, that's when this form is executed in binding. That's when the parties then have a contract. And that's what makes the multiple counteroffer different. It takes into consideration there are going to be multiple counters to multiple buyers. Multiple buyers may sign and return. So you can't have the power of making it or executing the document in the hands of the buyer, or else you may have multiple buyers and create conflict of terms with multiple buyers, multiple contracts for one property. That's why the seller signs to make this binding and execute this document. And these are the 3 counteroffers you need to go counteroffer crazy. You can do as many counteroffers as you need to. This is all you need. Hope you found this informative. If you have any questions, please